Welcome, everybody, to the A Little Less Fear podcast. I'm your producer and host of the show, Dr. Lino Martinez. This is your motivational podcast of people's incredible journeys. Oh yeah, let's do this. Welcome back, everybody, to the A Little Less Fear podcast. Today, I would love to introduce John Schlimm. Is a Harvard-trained educator, artist, advocate, and international award-winning author of 25 books. His international award-winning book, What Would Gen Z Do? Everything you don't know about Gen Z but should. John Schlimm was among the first to start piecing together the authentic and multifaceted face of Generation Z beyond the stigmas, stereotypes, and often misguided media profiling of these dynamic young people who remain largely misunderstood and vastly underestimated. Welcome, John, to A Little Less Fear podcast.
I am so excited to be here with you and all of your listeners. We're going to have so much fun.
We already are having fun. I love this energy. I love this dynamic. Thanks so much for being on my show. So this is a show of personal growth. And there's all kinds of people, all walks of life that come in here. So just welcome. And thank you so much for coming onto this platform to educate the world about a topic I've never had on my podcast before. So before we get into the actual topic of Generation Z, what brought you to your current journey today and this passion that you have about this generation?
Well, first of all, I'm so happy to be part of your show's mission of growth. Certainly, I have started to better understand as I, approach 52 years old, the whole concept of growth, but also, Gen Z, which we'll be talking about, is so much a part of the growth of our country right now and the world. So I love that you are out there talking about that concept. So many different things bring us all to the journey and to the point where we are in life. And, right now, I am just really having some of the best moments of my life. I'm getting to write the books I want to write. I'm getting to do the art I want to do. I'm getting to focus on the advocacy projects that I really want to work on. And as an educator, I'm finding different ways that I really enjoy to embrace that role. So it's, after several decades of climbing that mountain and exploring and figuring out who I am and what I want to do, I feel like I finally reached that great point. And it's just a stop. The mountain continues.
Absolutely.
And we keep heading on. But I just feel so fortunate to be at that point where everything I'm getting to do, I'm really just loving how I'm getting to do it.
John, how did you get there? And how did you realize you were there?
It's one of those things that I think you just instinctually know when you get there. And for me, I love practicing gratitude every day. And I know you're the same. I try to embrace gratitude for everything from the smallest things that I experience to the biggest, and even the challenges and the bad things I'm always grateful for because I'm learning something from them. And I think that comes from a life journey of just continuing to move forward. And no matter how bad it got at points, you know that you can still put one foot in front of another. And eventually you're going to get where you're supposed to be. And that's not always where we necessarily at first think we're meant to be. But I just kept moving forward and knew that one day I would find my way as a writer, as an artist, as an advocate, and as an educator. And, in the last few years, when that moment finally came and I'm like, wow. And then it's like, okay, keep moving forward and let's see now what this grows into.
John, was it the constant push or acceptance or allowance of practicing gratitude daily that brought you to this peak where you're at right now?
Well, I think that was definitely a big part of it. And I think also just at some point along the way, learning that especially the bad things that we've experienced, whether it was bullying when I was younger, that I'm sure a lot of your listeners can relate to, or just the challenges of going through your 20s and figuring out, did I choose the right profession and where am I supposed to be? And you're just figuring out who you are. I think when you realize that all of those hard and even awful things really can be used as incredible tools to make ourselves stronger.
Definitely.
And look, it took me, into my 40s to fully realize, and I'm still continuing to fully realize just how we can use those bad things. And sometimes I think they're put in our way for a reason, and we can either see them as a stop sign, or as just a green light to keep on going and to learn something from them.
And when you followed that green light and learning from these other things that maybe were mistakes or lessons learned, or however you want to describe it, did you find that doors started to open up for you a little easier?
They did. I think that is always an ongoing challenge, because, sometimes we think like, okay, if we just think it hard enough and long enough, the doors will start popping open.
Sure.
And sometimes they do. And here's the thing. Sometimes it's not the door you thought would open, it's another one. And, which leads us to being really open-minded. And I have tried, and that's another daily journey, just to keep opening our minds, because, I know from experience, and I'm sure you and your listeners do as well, we can get to a point where we think, oh, we are so open-minded.
No, that's far from the truth.
Right. If we're really honest with ourselves, there's still work to do. And it's not about judging ourselves. It's just about realizing that that's also a lifelong journey. And, the other thing that's been so important to my journey is the concept of forgiveness.
Oh,
and
huge.
Huge. And I mean, maybe the hugest, because, there's always going to be suffering in this life, right?
Absolutely.
That's just baked in from the minute we're born. There's going to be suffering, and there's always going to be someone who has hurt us and someone who we've hurt, and likely lots of people in both directions. So the sooner we can learn to forgive others, and it's not easy, right? If it were easy, it'd be meaningless. Sometimes it takes years of work, hard work, to forgive. But once we understand forgiveness needs to be that first step, and not just forgiveness of others, but also forgiving ourselves for things that we've done, that is such a weight lifted off of our shoulders. So maybe forgiveness, above everything we've just talked about, has really been the most important part, because nothing clears the way like forgiving. And oftentimes I think people get stuck in this mindset of, well, I don't want to forgive, clench fists. I don't want to forgive because that's letting someone off the hook. And it's like, that's not true. Sure, it absolutely is a gift you're giving to that person, but it's also a bigger gift you're giving to yourself.
You know what I'm thinking as you said that also, if you don't forgive yourself, you're also in a state of a victim consciousness, like a victim mentality. And when you can step out of that forgiveness, step into forgiveness and forgive yourself and know that you're not a victim and know that nobody's perfect and that there is a lesson to learn, then that's when self-love develops. And then that's when you're able to find more of your authentic voice. And that's when doors start to open up for you.
Yes. The clearer you can make that path in front of you, the easier it is going to be to really have that focus and start realizing that the things you really dream of and the things you really want to achieve are possible and are there. I have this phrase that I love to use. And in fact, I even titled the commencement address that I delivered with this title: "The road to yes is paved with many no's."
Oh, I love that.
Yes is paved with many no's. And it's all of those no's, which certainly when we're younger, I know when I was younger, you just get so frustrated, as a writer, when I first started out and the rejection letters just poured into my mailbox.
Right.
And by the way, after learning this idea of, every one of those rejection letters was just a stepping stone. That publisher was not the publisher meant for that project, but the yes would eventually come, and it did. I have saved every rejection letter. I have an entire file cap because guess what? I still get those rejection letters.
Yeah.
Unfortunately now my agent has to be the bearer of that bad news.
Oh.
But I still keep them. They just go right in the file. And I'm actually, when they come now, the first words out of my mouth sincerely are, thank you. Because yes. I know, all right, you were not the right editor. You were not the right publisher.
Exactly.
Maybe this isn't even the right book project right now, but I have faith that, all of those no's will move me where I'm meant to be. And that really has never failed.
All rejections are redirections.
Oh, I love that.
Yeah.
You and I could start a line of t-shirts.
I know. Right? We should. That'd be fun. So I really love how you said that the road to yes is paired with many no's. So what about when you do get a yes? How do you go on that yes ride? How do you ride the wave of yes?
That's such a great question. And I think, it's so easy, especially in the business that you and I are in, which is essentially the entertainment business. And you see this happening all the time when there's an audience. It's very easy for that ego to expand. And I think we all have moments of that, especially early on in our career. But what I really try to do now, and have probably for the last 2 decades, is greet that yes, ride that wave of yes with as much humility as I can muster. Because I know, even though it might be my name that's on the book cover, yes, I know there are dozens of people who made that book happen.
Exactly.
It's not just John Schlimm. It's not just for me to take the credit. And I love the concept of humility, which is also another daily journey that we really have to work hard at. And so I try to live as simply as possible, which you can always improve upon, of course. But yeah, I think when we get those great successes, and there's nothing wrong with embracing them, I get excited, it's awesome. But then it's like, okay, I want to be humbled by this rather than have the ego swell into something even I don't recognize.
Definitely. So what is your definition of humility?
Oh, my goodness. Woo. Well, I think there could be many components to that, and especially had you given me time to think more about this. But I love that you didn't. I think that, at least one part of humility is realizing that we are just a small piece of the larger puzzle. That is this universe, or whatever you want to call it. We're just one small piece that collectively works together.
I love that.
Right.
Yeah. Which is we all are the collective, and we are all one. And it just takes a multi piece of us to be working together to create harmony together, and something that we're co-creating.
Yeah, and look, like when I have to go to write the acknowledgments section for my books, I drive my editor crazy, because I'm like, I want to make sure every possible name that we can get in there to thank, which I know it isn't always about that, but it's like at least one part, because I just never want to miss out on thanking someone who was involved. And invariably you're going to. But look, if I had my way, even like the mail carriers who bring those books from Amazon or Barnes and Noble to people's doorsteps, if I could include their names, I would. You just can't. But I think that's where humility comes in. And as long as you know that, you're doing your best, but you're still this small piece of the puzzle, I think you're at least moving the collective a step forward.
Exactly. And just like, as you're saying that, I'm just feeling the grace and the gratitude of even having you on this platform, and knowing that it took people that made my laptop to make this possible, the lights in front of me to make it possible, the sound waves, the microphone. Like, there's just so much that goes on behind the scenes and behind the scenes that we just can't. Humility is really one of the most beautiful things that you can do to include everyone equally and unconditionally.
And you know what? One of the first moments that was really put right in front of me, that we're just this small piece and we have to really think of who all is involved in everything. When I was a student at Harvard, Thich Nhat Hanh, who you may be familiar with, a Buddhist monk. And if your listeners aren't, check him out. He's very cool. He has since passed away, but very cool. He visited the university. And one of the things he talked about was eating an orange. So an orange that, and you can pop in apple, banana, whatever you want.
Yeah.
Lollipop, I don't know. But orange. And he said, think of this orange. And he actually had an orange. And he's like, think of, the people who just brought it to me today where I am, on the grounds of this university. But think about who handled it in the store, who brought it to the store,
Who picked it.
All the way back to who put that seed in the ground.
Yeah. Yes.
And, and where did that seed come from that got into that hand of the person who put it in the, so it was just light bulb, when he said that. And so, I really have to credit him with giving me that first visual of thinking that, no, it's not just us.
No, never.
We sometimes I think it's just us. It's not. Right. And it almost becomes a fun game to start creating that chain back to the beginning with anything, with absolutely anything.
And that is definitely a true, damn good reason to be in humility and be definitely. I love that. So, Gen Z.
Yes.
I'm certain that there's listeners that don't know much about Gen Z. So, who is Gen Z? What is Gen Z? Let's start there.
So, I'll start with this teaser. Everything we have talked about, I was pretty much already working on when I came across the first wave of Gen Zers in my classroom about 7 years ago. But in those 7 years, they took all of that in addition to so much more and just amped up the level of what I have learned about life, about this world that we live in. They, until my dying day, which I hope is very long from now, they will be among the greatest teachers I have ever had in this life.
I love this.
Because they get so much of this on a level that no generation before them has gotten at that age. But, to break it down, so Generation Z, that's anyone who was born between 1997 and 2012. So this year, 2023, it's anyone age 11 to 26.
Oh, wow.
And when you think about that, what an incredible moment in a generation to have a generation spanning elementary school to the first years of being in the workforce. Yes. For any generation, that's extraordinary. When you think one end to the other, I first crossed paths with them when they were first getting into college. And I'm sure years earlier, I also crossed paths, but they didn't have a name yet.
Sure. Right now as you're saying this, I totally had a misconception of who Gen Z was. And thank you for clarifying that for myself, even ages 11 to 26 years old. So what I find interesting and fascinating about this age group, see, I think I had my first computer when I was maybe in my early 20s. And my first printer was like a dot matrix. It was so slow. And like maybe one page a minute, maybe, and it... Oh my goodness. And it just seems that this generation is growing up with a whole different world in a whole different dimension. And it just feels like this age group, 11 to 26, and even knowing my niece and nephews, they're around that age. And it just feels that they're so readily available with knowledge that I didn't, no way that I have back then. And I'm not just talking about technological knowledge. I'm also talking about generational knowledge and even vocabulary words that I never used back when I was their age. And just the fact that some of them can understand concepts that there's no way I would have understood at that age. And they understand it so fast and so easily.
Yes. And, I think there are so many misconceptions about them, which I, have worked really hard the last 7 years and will continue to work on trying to clear up and trying to introduce a generation to, older adults. But yeah, you're absolutely right. And look, when I first met them, So we'll go back 7 years on the university campus where I was teaching at the time. I had 2 classes of freshmen and first year students. And I had never heard the term Gen Z before. But even just in the first 1 to 2 weeks, I knew there was something a little bit different about this generation. But I thought we were still in the land of the millennials. And look, I loved millennials. I was, a fan of theirs. I don't think any generation has been as stereotyped and as bashed and made fun of as the millennials. So, and I've tried to clear up those misperceptions as much as I could as well. But I even commented to my colleagues, I'm like, there's just something a little bit different about this group of first-year students. And they were all like, oh, yeah. So then one day in class, I referred to them as millennials, as a matter of fact, not in a negative way. And they were all like, like in unison, like, woo, bam. And I was like, whoa, like, first of all, okay, I was on to something. And second of all, what is this amazing universe then that is forming before my very eyes? And so I said, well, who or what are you then?
Right.
And they said, we're Generation Z. And I'm like, okay. And I'm like, you know what? I'm going to spend the next couple months of this semester figuring out what that means. And as soon as the first discussions started happening in class, essays started being turned in, presentations started happening, that's when there was just this immediate click. And I knew the honesty and courage with which they spoke, especially about their mental health challenges, completely blew me away. I've never seen that before. And certainly no generation before them had ever been that open and courageous, mainly because, so I'm an Xer, I'm a proud Gen Xer. I love Gen X, but we weren't allowed to talk about those things. So when we were their age in the 80s and in the early 90s, it's not that we didn't have mental health struggles but you weren't allowed to talk about them at home, in school, in the community, at church, wherever you might be. In fact, I don't even think in the 80s I heard the word anxiety. And maybe depression, and certainly suicide if it was brought up, or someone in the community died by very hush hush. And you're like, well, what happened? And so to see these young people speak so openly, I just instantly became their number one fan. And I'm like, you guys, do you realize that by just speaking aloud words like anxiety, depression, suicide, I need help, it is already the biggest gift you as a generation have given to the world. And it is already the largest leap forward the world has ever seen in mental health awareness and advocacy. And they were just like, really? Because this is just every day to them, which I just love. So it was almost instantaneous that I became their number one fan.
Question here. This Generation Z that you're speaking of, this openness, is this mostly seen in the United States, or are you seeing this around the world?
Well, that is a really great question. And, to be perfectly honest, I don't really know, because my work, for the most part, has been focused here in the United States, and I'm only 6-7 years into it. But, what I started to do, because, I think as an advocate, and in that word, as well as activist, they get thrown around. Everybody's an advocate. Everybody's an activist.
Yeah.
And then as a result, gives it all a bad name, no matter what side you're coming from. For me, I really think being an advocate for young people, being a mental health advocate, means I've got to continue to stay on my game and learn as much as I can. And so as I, not only in my classroom and here locally, but as I have traveled the country during the last several years, whether it's been on book tour or for art installations, or I've just been invited to do whatever I've been invited to do, I always say to whoever's organizing my trip, I'm happy to come and do whatever you've invited me for, of course, but while I'm on the ground in your town or city, please find me a group of Gen Zers to sit down with if I'm not already, and please find me mental health experts to sit down with, because nothing substitutes sitting down with people who are experts or people who are living and going through what you are interested in.
Sure.
So as a result, I have sat down with, thousands of Gen Zers across the country and health experts, from elementary school psychologists to, top mental health officials in the state, because I asked. And I continue to do that as much as I can, because I think it's important to really continue to learn about whatever it is we're trying to make a difference with.
Especially because you see their evolution and you've seen what a head start that they have compared to all the other generations before them.
Yeah, and to your question actually about internationally, so that has been my experience nationally. But what has been interesting, since What Would Gen Z Do came out, the foreign language rights have been sold in Spanish. So a Spanish edition is going to be coming out, as well as an edition in Vietnam, which I thought was so interesting.
Yes.
So, clearly something, in the Spanish language world, which is huge, but also in Vietnam, something about this book spoke to those publishers. So I'm hoping that, as those books get out into the world, and hopefully more foreign language versions will also go, I will start to learn more about what Gen Zers are like in other cultures.
I love this. It sounds like it's on its way there. So you spoke of earlier, you said the word misconceptions. What are some of these misconceptions of Generation Z?
Oh my goodness, how much time do you have?
Oh geez.
It's almost a fill in the blank. And okay, so we'll just go over some of the top ones. They get this rap for being lazy. They don't know how to do anything like answering a landline telephone or using a copy machine. They're not hard workers. They're weak. They're snowflakes. Which snowflakes I thought was a stereotype that belonged to the poor millennials. So folks have just carried, which was not always true of millennials either, but folks have carried it over. And it's like, I love just knocking down every single one of those. And of course, in any generation, you can take whatever the stereotype or criticism is, and you can, if you look hard enough, you can find someone who fits it, or even
Something
group of
parallel there. Yeah,
absolutely. So, and and the media loves to find that small group who may, maybe aren't so ambitious in some way, which every generation, and suddenly that represents the entire generation. And it's like, this is not true. Because I'm like, are any of you in the media, or any of the other adults who are throwing these stereotypes? I'm like, are you sitting down with any of the Zers that I've sat down with locally here in Pennsylvania, but also across the country? I mean, not only are they going to school, but some of them have, one job, sometimes two jobs. And maybe that's because they're putting themselves through school, but also some of them are also the breadwinners for their families. They're in high school, but their paycheck is the one that's being brought home and supporting their family. So it's like, this is not a lazy generation. Sure, you can find maybe those who are. Again, look in any generation and you'll find any stereotype you want to find. But by and large, you've got to look at the tens of millions who exist there somewhere in the middle or between these extremes. And you're going to find individuals who are hardworking, to the point of being shy and quiet. Look, when that was brought to my attention, I'm like, well, I'm going to go right to the source, and which I do with all of these. Like when someone says, oh, well, Gen Z is this, now I've been around them enough that I can be like, well, no, they're not. And these are the reasons. But in the beginning, I would go back, whatever group of Gen Zers, whether it was in my class or whoever I was seeing next, I'd be like, okay, so people are telling me that you're lazy. I don't believe that, but you tell me why you think people are saying that. Because my first rule of thumb is, if you have a question about them, go to the source. I'm happy to answer it for you. I wrote a whole book answering it for you, but nothing substitutes going to the Zers in your life and saying, why does your generation like tattoos so much? Why are there so many gamers in your generation? Because I've asked those questions, and you know what? Every time I've asked those questions, I've come away with even greater respect and more love for these young people. But to the point of them being like quiet and introverted, okay, because that's a biggie, and I've seen this play out where I'll be at a party, like for example, two Christmases ago, I was at a party where there were mostly older adults. And this family came and they had a Gen Zer. His name is Wyatt. And at the time, I think he was a sophomore. He comes in, he goes right to a corner with two books, huddles in the corner. And of course, I loved it because I knew exactly what was playing out here. But I watched like the other people who were, spanned their late 20s to even someone in their 90s. And they just looked at this kid like he had just landed from Mars. Of course, I'm loving it. Eventually he walked up, started to walk by me, and I'm like, hey, what are your books about? That turned into a 3-hour discussion about everything. So when I have asked the Zers, why is there this perception about you? They will tell me two main things. One, a lot of them have social anxiety. Mm-hmm. And, so I, for my 50 plus years, have been on a journey with anxiety. So I understand at least my version of anxiety. But at the time, this was several years ago, I'd never heard the term social anxiety. Mm-hmm. So I said, this was someone in my class that brought this up. I said, what exactly is social anxiety? And so by now, you and your listeners, even though we've only been together maybe 30 minutes, get an idea of what my classroom is like. Mm-hmm. Yeah. It's pretty laid back. Luckily, I'm not teaching chemistry where things can go if things aren't, I could never do that. So one of the students said, John, even in your class, what that means is there are several of us who would not get up and walk across the back of the room to throw out something into the garbage can because we would have this fear of people looking at us and judging us. Even though it may be the most irrational, like no one's going to do that, they have that fear. That was powerful. The other thing that they told me, the other reason why they tend to be so quiet is because of the heavily divisive culture we currently live in every direction, right? So many of them are afraid to be the first to talk because they are so afraid that they will accidentally say the wrong thing. Okay. And suddenly you utter that wrong syllable, that wrong word, even accidentally, you're canceled, you're this, you're that, Mm-hmm. So, wow. So, what that has taught me, and I tell others, is sometimes we have to be the first ones to approach them, which doesn't hurt us, Right. And if we're afraid to do that, we may need to check in with our own social anxiety.
Oh, yeah, definitely.
Again, these are not like Martians from outer space. They're not wild animals that you need to approach cautiously in the wilderness. And I guarantee if you go up and say, oh, cool tattoo, what inspired you to get it? Or, of course, I'm talking come from a place of non-judgment, even if you think it's weird. And I tend to love weird. So, why is your hair blue? That conversation will go on for as long as you want it to go on and in a million different directions. And it will be they will be some of the greatest conversations you'll ever have.
I can definitely see that. But I'm wondering though, the whole social anxiety you were talking about, but what's causing their social anxiety? Are they aware of that?
Well, I think here's one of the things that I have really learned, and I even write about it in the book, is we cannot be afraid to say, I don't know. I don't know what the answer to that is. And, in the book, I really talk about that in response to the rate of suicides in this generation, because this generation has a higher suicide rate of any generation in history, yet they are more open and courageous about their mental health struggles. And, I actually had my best friend, I think he was just tired of me always like going on about Gen Z. And one day he was like, okay, you are constantly saying how open and courageous these young people are, then why about their mental health and why do they have the highest suicide rate? And at first it was like a gut punch because I'm like, oh, wow. And it really is a great question.
It is.
But both of those things can be true. which isn't always the case when we're asked a complicated question like that. But I'm like, both of those things can be true. And I'm comfortable in saying I don't have the answer, but I'm continuing to pursue the answer with every Gen Zer I talk to. And I think in terms of the social anxiety, there's no shortage of the research and the studies, and and a lot of time, and we need those. I get we all need to be lab rats at some time or another. This is how one way we learn about each other. But sometimes when I see these studies, I kind of wonder, again, who are the Gen Zers you talk to? Because of the thousands I've talked to, it doesn't really line up in quite the same way. Albeit I'm not really being scientific. I'm more anecdotal on the street, but still, thousands of Gen Zers are still thousands of, it's a good sample. The social anxiety, I really do not have a complete answer for. But what I would encourage you and your listeners to do, ask that question of Gen Zers, because I think you're going to get answers you never expected. A lot of answers may be the same. I think it could fall in that category of, them not wanting to say or do the wrong thing because of the moment we're living in. I think there could be a lot of answers to that question. So I would really encourage people to ask the Zers, because I continue to ask them. And, in this age range of 11 to 26, we have to, and I have to keep doing this to myself. Yes, they're a generation, but they are all individuals. That 26-year-old Gen Zer is not going to necessarily be like the 11-year-old Gen Zer.
Oh, no way.
So you really have to take that into account as well. Right. That from one end of that generation to another, you're also going to see changes, because that's like a decade and a half apart.
Sure is. Yeah, I find it challenging, and I find that as you're saying this, I'm feeling that technology is also going to be the instigator to a lot of people's social anxiety. And it's like everything is online. Everything's on the palm of your hand. Whereas before you were kind of forced into human interaction, and now everything's, even AI now. And like, what's reality these days even? So it's like who and a lot of gamers, as you were saying, a lot of people playing against other people across the world, not really seeing like an actual physical body in front of them. That could, just to thinking outside the box, that could definitely contribute to any type of social anxiety when you're not used to seeing people face to face. It becomes a little more real. And I think that can definitely, what is real in that point? You know what I mean?
Right. But I think we also have to realize, and, the more you talk to actual Gen Zers, they are, for the most part, very good at that one-on-one interaction. As long as you, approach them and come to them with respect and and being willing to listen to also what they have to say. It doesn't mean you have to agree with everything.
Sure.
Some of the greatest discussions you're going to have is if you calmly, express that, oh, you disagree with this or that. That's awesome. But they're still good at those personal interactions, but they get this bad rap for not being. And I think the media has perpetuated that. And when we think about technology, it's one of my favorite questions that comes up, because it always comes up, whether it's in interviews or if I'm, talking to a group of especially older adults. I'll always be like, what about social media? Because again, especially the media and some researchers out there have people like running around with like their hair on fire, like, oh, these kids are all rotting their brains on their social media. So the first thing I love to do to an audience of older adults is say, okay, before we get to the Zers and their use of, those screens in front of their faces, whether it be social media or video games, I want you to just check in with yourself for a moment and think about your own use on a daily basis.
Oh, yeah.
And it's just like this light bulb. And they're like, oh. So we really have to, before we're jumping on them, we really have to think about our own use of it. Sure. And here's the other part. Yes, they are on social media. They're online in front of screens a lot, like a lot of us are. But the question then becomes, what are they doing on there? And
Yeah.
when you ask that question, you get some really fantastic, they might be, they might hear about a certain country, say in the Middle East, in the news. Well, guess what? They're on that screen researching that or researching whatever the issue is. They're actually reading articles. And I've had this done even in class. I'm the type of teacher, I've learned to pick my battles. And again, I'm not teaching chemistry. So, if someone's on their phone, I don't really get upset about that because I've tested this out. They might be on their phone. If I call on them, they will answer whatever question or respond to whatever was being talked about. And so I did that a little bit as an experiment in the beginning. So they're incredible multitaskers in that way. But I've also learned that if we're talking about a certain topic in class, most of the time they're on their phone trying to get more information in real time, on that issue. So before you jump to conclusions, maybe ask them, well, what exactly are you doing on there? And a lot of times it's also, when they're talking to friends or to others, it's their help. Maybe that friend is going through a hard time and they're offering advice or comfort. So when it comes to Gen Z or the rest of us, we've got to get in our minds not to assume what is going on and not to pay too much attention to what we hear in the media.
One thing I've noticed about Gen Z is they're incredible troubleshooting.
Yes.
Yeah.
And the gamers, so video gamers, really exemplify a lot of what we're talking about when it comes to screen time and, because they, if any subgroup within a generation gets a stereotype, the video gamers from the beginning of time, it's since the beginning of Atari, which is what I grew up with, Atari and Pac-Man, there's the stereotype of the gamer in their parents' basement that's dark and 24/7 and they're, eating chips and drinking soda and rotting their brain. And again, I'm sure you can find that person out there. And I would love to have a conversation with that. That would make me really curious to talk to those people. But, the gamers I've taught, and I'm so not a gamer. I always tell gamers, if you want to beat someone every time, ask me to play with you. But I'm fascinated by it. And so the more I've talked to Gen Z gamers, the more they have taught me the amount of skill that goes into playing these games, and not only skills they already have, but the skills they're learning. So when we, throw around terms like social emotional learning, critical thinking, strategic thinking, communication skills, even the visual graphics, they're cultivating that in these video games. And also, I hope, having fun, because we all still have to have fun. And video game, it's a game. And I'm backed up on this by, major corporations as well as the US military, both of which in recent years have started actively recruiting video gamers, especially from millennials and Gen Z, because they understand the skills. And these are skills that the military and these corporations need moving into the future. So this is the point where the gamers are starting to win the public perception game. And I'm happy to help them out on that, because I think it's just fantastic.
If you were to use your imagination, thanks for sharing on that. I totally agree with you. It is fantastic. It really is. If you were to use your imagination, John, and picture Gen Z when they're in their 50s and 60s, what do you think the world is going to be like?
Oh boy, that is the $1 trillion question for any of us.
What do you imagine?
Okay, so that would put me in probably my 80s or 90s. And I am still going to hopefully be sitting down and talking with groups of them. I think I will, my respect and admiration for them will just continue to grow. I think that they ultimately are bringing more good to the world than not. And I think that we need to just work a little harder as older adults at trying to better understand them. And again, it does not mean letting them just have their way with everything. It means we need to realize there's a lot we can learn from them, but there's also a lot they can learn from us. And, to all the older adults out there who are listening right now, trust me when I say every time I am talking with a group of Gen Zers and we're talking about different generations, I am always encouraging them to engage in conversations with older adults because, I want them to better understand who those older adults are, even if sometimes those older adults in their life can be frustrating. And look, Gen Z especially adores their grandparents. And I think most of their grandparents would be in that baby boomer and maybe next up generation. So to all the grandparents out there listening, whatever you're doing, please keep doing it. Like you're rock stars and you're grandkids, to the point that when something bad happens to you, it has an almost paralyzing effect on these young people. I talked to one young man who he failed an entire junior year in high school because he lost a grandparent, and he just could not wrap his mind around that. And and almost to a Gen Zer, when I bring this up, they adore their grandparents. Parents, that will always be a little more of a challenging dynamic. And most parents of Gen Zers are my generation, Gen X. So what they've done, in addition to giving me a front row seat to their generation, they've opened up a window into my generation to see, wow, in what ways we're still kind of messed up, in what ways we've really advanced,
right.
And just kind of the work that we need to continue to do moving forward. But I like to think that they have such beautiful hearts at the end of the day, and they understand compassion on such an extraordinary level that I think when they're my age, when they're in their 50s, I think the world will be a better place for them having been here, no matter what's going to still be getting thrown at them. And I'm sure it's going to be a lot.
I have definitely noticed that. I've noticed that Gen Z, their hearts are a lot more open, than my heart was at that age. That's for sure.
Yeah. And, one of the assignments that I would often have my students do, and it's also, so at the end of Gen Z, I wanted what would Gen Z do? I wanted the book to be interactive. And, the book is not for Gen Zers. It's for everyone older than Gen Z who lives with Gen Zers, works with Gen Zers, parents, teachers, employers. I wanted it to be interactive. So at the end of each chapter, there are 2 reflection questions. One that you ask yourself as the reader to kind of check in with where you're at on the topic of that chapter. But then there's a question that I encourage you to ask a Gen Zer, because I want to encourage that communication. And at the end of the book, I included several different interactive projects that you can do with Gen Zers as a way for you to get to know them better, as a way for them to get to know you better. And many of them are based off of projects and assignments I would do in my class. But one, to your original question of what they'll be like someday, I would ask them to write 2 essays. One, a letter to their 5-year-old self, based on, so at that point, they were like 17, 18, 19 years old, going back and telling that 5-year-old about the journey of those next, 10, 13 years, whatever it was going to be. Those letters were some of the sweetest, kindest letters I've ever read. And then the other letter I asked them to write was a letter to their 80-year-old self.
Wow.
Sort of having them really having to look forward and predict what that's going to be like.
I love that.
And again, I'll tell you what, I wasn't even halfway through the first letter and I'm in tears of joy, tears of sorrow. This is a generation that will simultaneously fill your heart and break it. But at the end of the day, you come away loving them more and more and more. But, when I read these letters of, how they foresee the next 60 years of their life, they understood there's going to be challenges. They understood, that they might be going from job to job to job to find, where they belong in this world. They, many of them hope to have families, but it was all, for the most part, with optimism. Now, if you turn on the news, you would think this generation is hopeless, the most pessimistic, and it's not true. So, maybe don't believe everything you hear on TV, even in commercials and on TV shows now. When I see the way Gen Zers are portrayed, I'm like, they're really just perpetuating some ugly stereotypes. But you know what? I'm going to always be there to knock those stereotypes right down.
And I love that you wrote a book about this to break down those misconceptions. I love that you're doing this to educate the world. Really, John, that's really incredible. Thank you for doing what you've done.
Oh, well, you're welcome. And, it is just my pleasure. And, the chapters in the book are all about what Gen Zers across this country have told me that they want the world to know about them. So I am merely just being a messenger for them. This book is very much a love letter to a generation. But right up front, I say no one person can be an expert on an entire generation. But I can certainly, paint as bright a picture and sometimes dark as I possibly can in conveying who these young people truly are and how you can just start to have a relationship or a renewed relationship with the young people in your life.
I love this, John. Thanks so much for sharing. This has been really enlightening and encouraging, motivating. I really appreciate you sharing your entire journey and just where you're at today. Where can our viewers, our watchers, and our listeners get your book and find you? If you do have a website, how can we get a hold of you?
Well, the book is available wherever books are sold. So wherever you love to get your books, we love independent bookstores, but we also still love Amazon and Barnes and Noble. And so whatever your bookstore jam is, please go there, including libraries. I love libraries. So if your library doesn't have it, please encourage them to get it, because we've got to keep our libraries in business as well. And as far as I go, people can go to my website, which is johnschlimm.com. That's John, John, Schlimm, SCHLIMM.com. And all my social media links are also there. And I love connecting with people over social media. So come find me and let me know what you think of the book.
John Schlimm, everybody, on A Little Less Fear podcast. Thanks so much. It's been an honor connecting with you and sharing your incredible wisdom light here with the world. Thank you so much.
Oh, well, you are most welcome. And thank you for everything you do. You are such a rock star, and I am such a fan of yours.
Hey, it takes one to know one.
No ego here, right?
I know, right?
We'll practice our humility.
Exactly. Thank you, John.
You're welcome.
Thank you all so much for tuning in to the Dr. Lino Show, A Little Less Fear podcast. If you'd like to get a hold of me, you can do so by sending me an email at alittlelessfear@gmail.com or through an inquiry from my website at www.alittlelessfear.com, where you will always find information on where to get my book. You can get my book on Amazon and Amazon paperback version, Kindle or Kindle Unlimited. And I also create incredible visual video poetry for people that are interested in marketing, or even just to send a personal note to anybody or somebody that you might love. So yeah, check it out. I love it. Poetry is my passion, one of my other passions, aside from doing what I do right now, which is giving you all the motivation that you need to keep growing, to keep motivating people, motivating yourself, and to keep expanding. I love you all so much. Have a blessed day and take care. Rock on.